Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, it has been a week. This one, included another New York City trip for a podcast, my first PT session for this lingering neck injury, which is doing better, my wife's birthday, my dog's 7th anniversary with us, also known as his gotcha day, and my oncology check-in yesterday. Everything went well, including and especially that last one. My white blood cell count did not increase at the rate that would trigger concern and lead to some decisions about treatment. So right now I'm still in watch and wait mode. Just go test and, see if it ever progresses. And my next appointment is 3 months from now. That'll be around the 3rd anniversary of my diagnosis with this chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And what I noticed yesterday, even though I went in suspecting I would be getting bad news, is that my sense of relief has diminished, if you get me. I didn't come out of it with, thank God I got another 3-month lease on life. Now that may be chalked up to residual winter depression. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I was pretty down with everything, physical pain and other stuff going on. And I will tell you, I sat on the can with my head in my hands, just muttering, "You have cancer." And I wonder now if it's just a diminishing returns thing, I guess. That is the more times I play this white blood cell roulette and the chamber keeps coming up empty. I don't know if I've become kind of numb to it all, but check back in 3 months and I'll let you know. Now, as the rest of last week goes, the podcast went well. That conversation with Keith Mayerson will be coming in a couple of weeks. I took Amy out for a really nice lunch after making a watercolor birthday card for her. Benny, our dog, and I took a long walk/hike for his gotchaversary. And PT has me back doing my yoga workout and my morning exercise routine again. So that's something. It'll get me out of my head that I described a little earlier. And most importantly, I have a real episode for you this time instead of a monologue like last week. So my guest this time is Brad Gooch, who last graced this show in 2017. That was for his biography of the poet Rumi. This time, Brad's new biography, Radiant, The Life and Line of Keith Haring, just came out today, March 5th, 2024, for you time travelers, from Harper. And it's phenomenal. Brad, oh God, he brings us the details and the overarching story of Keith Haring's incredible and too brief life. I mean, he shows us the childhood in Kutztown, Pennsylvania in the 60s and 70s, and throughout that and into college, Haring's religious and intellectual stabs at meaning and the eye for art and design that kept evolving as he moved through that young life, going from Kutztown to college in Pittsburgh and on to his life in New York City. And Brad gets us the explosion of Keith's art, the explosion of gay life in that era, Haring's double mania of art making and partying and so much more. And Brad really does a fantastic job throughout the book of bringing Haring and his time to life and exploring the key phases of his art. Because it's one thing to see Herring now and sort of make icons, I guess, of some of those symbols of his, but to know that there was a progression and a development, and to see what it meant and what different forms and materials Herring was working with over the years, that part of the book just by itself is worth the price of admission. Now, someone who, well, yeah, I mean, if you know me, I'm somewhat dismissive of contemporary / modern art. I never had a context for Herring's work. I mean, I saw it and I dug the symbols. I was a teenager coming up and seeing the UFOs and B-boys and radiant babies and all that. And I appreciated how demotic it was, how it was meant for a public, I guess. And I knew that Herring died of AIDS at a pretty young age, but I never really got how he fit or didn't fit into the art world of the time, of the continuum of art, where he fit in sort of a post-Warhol world. But I'll say last year I recorded with the artist and writer and everything else, Timothy Goodman, and his work has resonances with Herring's work, and that started to give me some context for Keith Haring, especially that approach that Timothy has also of public art and the use of graffiti styles and techniques in different contexts. But it took Radiant, Brad's book, for me to really get how unique Herring's art and approach was, and what it was like to make that work during the 80s. And how his subject matter transformed over the course of that decade as the AIDS crisis began ravaging the gay male population in New York and beyond. And the book really brings home the terrible destruction of that era and the found families that took care of the afflicted when their biological families wouldn't. And I don't want to say it's all depressing. I mean, AIDS is a huge part of Herring's story, and it's a big part of Radiant, but the book itself is a celebration of everything Herring brought, all the art that he made and how he championed these causes, how he came out and came out about his AIDS and what it meant. I'll say that Brad, having lived through that world and that era, which he captures in the first podcast we did back in 2014 for his memoir about his partner, lover, Howard Bruckner, called Smash Cut. Brad is uniquely situated as Herring's biographer, and he's just masterful in how he recreates the New York City of Herring's meteoric heyday. At the same time, he goes deep into Herring's art and writing, and deep into the research and talking to the survivors who were there, going through the archives and records and trying to piece together what drove the man behind all this stuff and how Herring's art intersected with, I would say, with the world, but really with the worlds around him, whether it's the art world, whether it's a graffiti world, whether it's sort of Brad and I get into some of the intersectionality, as we'll put it, of Herring's life and art. And by the end of the book, in the 3+ decades since Herring's death, Brad gets into the lastingness of that art, the resurgence of Keith Haring, and how that art survived the comings and goings of the art world, and the impact Haring had. And it's really a fascinating life, and this book really helped me understand what Herring's art meant at the time and what it meant to him, and how he managed to produce so much. And that's really one of the astonishing parts of this book, which we'll talk about, is the productivity, the way Haring could just go and go and go, and not cheaply, not half-assing things. He kept making art as hard as he could for so many years, until the end. And whether that was for gallery exhibitions, for public murals that he was doing, for his little subway chalk pieces, he lived art. And well, I'll just say I loved Radiant. I love the fact that Brad was able to bring us this life and this era of New York. So go get Radiant, the life and line of Keith Haring, out now from Harper. Now, as caveats go, construction noise literally next door to Brad's building. You'll have to deal with it. It's still a good recording. And also, last week's monologue included that was the one I did about Japan when I didn't have a guest and just kind of talked for half an hour. That included an anecdote about this time I was in Japan on business, and I visited this large pharma services company and walked into the lobby and saw all of these herring prints and discovered that the husband and wife owners of the company were huge herring collectors, and they even had their own museum of his work. I'm not going to go into the whole story here. There's a bunch of little twerks and tweaks about it, but you can go listen to that one. I will say go check out the Nakamura Keith Haring collection online for more about that. Now here's Brad's bio from the book. Brad Gooch is a poet, novelist, and biographer whose previous books include Flannery, A Life of Flannery O'Connor, which was a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist, and a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and a New York Times bestseller. City Poet, The Life and Times of Frank O'Hara. God Talk, Travels in Spiritual America. The memoir Smash Cut, and Rumi's Secret, The Life of the Sufi Poet of Love. He is a recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities and Guggenheim Fellowships and lives in New York City. And now, the 2024 Virtual Memories conversation with Brad Gooch. So how did it begin as a book? In the epilogue, not to give away any spoilers, you mentioned it started as an idea for a novel, but
yeah, that's how it began. I mean, it began really in the 80s, or in the late 70s. I mean, not the idea of the novel, but Keith Haring was around at the same time that I was around, and so I would, and in different ways, kind of crossed with him. I would start with his art. I remember, which I wrote about in Smash Cut, Howard and I walking from the West Village to the East Village and saw these clones go home, stenciled, stamped messages on the corners, which was by Keith's made-up organization, Fags Against Facial Hair. That's an inside joke of the gay community. And then I remember seeing these like crawling babies on a newsstand in Soho, and then the subway drawings, of course, and also crossed with Keith somewhat. Supposedly he came to a book party that Dennis Cooper and I gave for ourselves at Limelight, and I remember seeing him at the reopening of the Apollo, where he and his fabulous posse like made an entrance. So in that way, and also when my lover Howard Brookner was sick with AIDS, Keith gave money, which was characteristic generosity of his. And I remember him at Howard's funeral, standing in the back with this kind of spooked look, since he was within a year of his own death at that point. So, I mean, he was always such a kind of charismatic, scenic guy from that time. And also in the 90s, then a lot of those artists, and especially like Haring and Basquiat, faded a little bit. Hard to believe now. But there was this, I think, feeling that the party was over somehow, and so all that was supposed to go away. Yeah. Even though there were retrospectives of their work at the Whitney in the 90s, but it wasn't quite the same. And so it just seemed, I mean, Keith was certainly known, but somehow novels seemed to me, just seemed like such a character, and that was stuck in my mind, and I didn't do it. Then we get to somewhere in the later, around probably 2017 when I saw you. But at some point then I actually had like an opening to write this book, and then I realized that I don't really like novels about famous artists, and, and B, the kind of Guinness Book of Records facts of Keith's life are so fantastic. I mean, he had that 10-year comet of a career. He created 10,000 works of art. Half of them were the subway drawings, but
they were works of art.
What happened to him was astonishing, and and the whole context history of it hadn't really been told. It hadn't been told as a real narrative, and so I think that was then why I thought biography. But biography is always informed by a kind of novelistic intent, I think, and that I was writing about something which I also knew in a different way than other biographies that I'd written, because I was there and I was describing places I'd seen. So that's...
I did find it interesting that you don't intrude. And outside of the preface and the epilogue, there is no I showing up, and yet you inform. Your experience seems to inform, so much of what's there. Exactly as you were saying, that 80s aspect, the club side of things, the galleries, etc.
Right.
This neighborhood that we're in.
Right.
It feels lived in, your book. It's not it raised a question for me when we mentioned 2017. Your previous biography was of Rumi, who had died hundreds and hundreds of years ago. How do those two projects differ? I guess with this one, you mentioned that he was bio ready. You had all the receipts. You had all the things that Keith had written.
Right. I mean, it's funny. People are always asking me that. I mean,
really, I feel kind of bad now.
No, not. But people not that exactly, but kind of. Well, how do these books go together? And only in my mind do they probably go together.
I'm going with Triptych with Smash Cut also, because those are the 3 books we've done together.
Yeah. Right. Smash Cut is a direct connection. Yeah. Actually, I had coffee with like a Hollywood guy of all people the other day, and he said to me, well, of course, it tracks that you did Rumi and then you did Keith Haring, because Keith was such a mystic and he was like, channeling all this work.
Sure.
Something I thought of, but doesn't come up a lot. And I was, that was a relief to me. But they were obviously very different I had to, in Rumi, kind of reconstruct 13th century world of Konya, and here I was writing about 80s downtown Manhattan, which I knew. The only similar is I always had that I like detail, and that I like setting up the reality of places in a way. So I think with Rumi, like someone was describing this book to someone else. I was standing there. She was saying...
Feeling self-conscious.
Yeah, but, she was saying... But it's amazing. He's like writing about 1250, and it's like... Rumi walked down the street of Konya and picked up, like, a vase or something. So I tried hard in that book to do what came a little more easily in this book, which was sense of place. And again, that was part of what I thought the world needed right now. There's a great John Gruen book that was put together in Keith's lifetime. I mean, Keith really wanted a biography of himself, but that was kind of an Edie structure where John had access to all these people, and then you have quotes from Madonna and William Burroughs and Keith. So it's a really valuable book. But sort of missing now and taken for granted then was, what was the Mud Club? What was Club 57? What was AIDS like? I mean, even, younger generation queers now don't really, they don't really know what it was like at that time, I think, to go through that.
Was it tough for you?
To revisit,
I mean, obviously lived through, but...
Yeah, and also, again, I think timely. I mean, I went to the Madonna concert recently.
Really?
Celebration, yes. And there's a moment, it's a retrospective concert for her. And so the early part is all bringing to life her songs and that same period, 80s New York. And then there's a moment where this, 5-story banner of, this was in Madison Square Garden, of Keith comes down, like right across from me. Wow. And then this 5-story banner of Howard comes down, like right next to it. And it was so shocking. I'd heard about it. She'd been doing this around the world, but to live it was really kind of startling. And to see those two together, it was so weird. And also, the picture of Howard was at the size, but then I realized, that was the striped Brooks Brothers shirt that he was wearing, because I'd never seen in any, just in the normal photograph size, I hadn't seen the detail of the stripes. So it flipped me out a little bit. But so I just, it does seem at this moment that there is a kind of, I wouldn't call it nostalgia, because that's a kind of trivial word for it, but like it hasn't, what you were talking about with Michael Dennedy, it's like it hasn't gone away as a profound experience for Madonna or for me or for, all kinds of people who lived through that, and it's now history. And so that was also part of the fun and thrill of the book, not the AIDS part.
But
all of this is history now, and Keith as a character was interesting because also our childhoods were resonated a little bit, because I was from.
I asked, where did you grow up?
Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Very similar.
To Cutstone.
Yes. And his parents, were very similar to my parents in the town. I got it. Also, that kind of background I understood very quickly. But to have, be writing about someone who, like me, was obsessed with television, and then the transition to color television, and the Monkees, and all this kind of pop cultural stuff of the moment, and that Keith was a Jesus freak for a while, and a Grateful Dead head.
Those are the things that kind of flip me.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm used to the more formed 80s New York Keith Haring. I'm like, he was that nerd. Okay.
Very much, with the glasses, right? But you did see where he comes from. I think all biographers buy into like that Wordsworth line, "The child is father to the man." That in some way, I don't think you'd be a biography if you thought the childhood doesn't matter.
I'm still trying to escape mine.
Okay. Well, and sometimes, as in the case of the Frank O'Hara generation, escape was what it was all about.
Yeah.
I remember Sonny Maida, my editor, saying, it's all about his running away from his mother. And, Keith is a different generation, and so a different relationship, a transitional kind of relationship with family and town and things, so he didn't completely leave it behind. I think that's also part of becomes very close to Andy Warhol, another artist from Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh in his case,
where Harry makes a stop for a while also.
For a couple of years. Andy's attitude towards popular culture was very kind of wry and ironic in a way, and kind of camp. So it was like you're holding up the soup can, but you're also rolling your eyes about the soup can in some way. And Keith was not ironic. He was very earnest, and he was just excited by these TV shows and by cartoons and by all of this popular culture. So it's part of the difference between them and what made Keith. I think the
I know it's a mug's game sort of thing, but imagining where he would have gone had he lived.
Well, in some ways, it's not that hard to imagine, because in some ways he feels it makes more sense now, I think, than he did in the 80s. He, all this that he was doing in terms of trying to make art for everybody and starting a store or a pop shop. I mean, no artist of the 80s started a store in that way. Certainly no art star of the 80s. And just the seeds of licensing that he had, and by doing the Swatch watch and the Absolute vodka, all this is now the world we live in. I mean, artists are very much keyed into popular culture, and he also has. There's another generation after him for whom Keith was their Andy Warhol, and thinking of like Cause and Banksy and Shepard Fairey. So that kind of sense of art is much more with us now, and taken for granted than I think it was in his time. And the also is social media. I mean, Keith worked in every available surface, right? And he worked in video, and it was all about communication for him. He said in one of his notebooks at School of Visual Arts, the message is the message, sort of countering the medium is the message. And so this kind of direct communication and this visual language and the activism, all that seems made for now. I mean, Keith on Instagram, forget it.
Yeah, I would say I'd be horrified, and I don't want to make a joke that, well, it's for the best then. Imagining that. But yeah, it's the way the lines you draw, especially in the epilogue, in those terms, about where the art went. That sense of a 30-year gap, or a 30-year look back, and how that's usually necessary for radical art shifts like this.
Right.
As we were talking about before we started, I was in Japan 4 years ago and discovered that one of the Japanese pharmaceutical research company owners turns out to be like the biggest herring collector out there. And I was just, how on earth did this happen in Japan? And then, reading your book, I'm like, oh, it makes all the sense in the world. Japan was a second home in a sense. I know we had Paris and all that, but the way you frame it, it seems like Tokyo was just...
No, I love Tokyo. Yeah. I mean, and it was the Tokyo of that moment.
Sure.
It was 80s Japan, which was similar to 80s Manhattan, and then you had this financial market kind of blowing everything up.
Supposedly yesterday, the Nikkei, the stock market, finally passed the high it made in 1989 before the Japanese financial crash. It's been struggling for 34 years to get to that level again.
Right.
But
I've been watching that because it's, it reminds me when I see the stories about the Japanese economy, reminds me of Keith and that moment that he was there. And at the same time, he had a relationship to it first with his father. I mean, his father was in Japan, stationed in Japan when he was in the military, and Keith's relationship with his father is very important too, because his father was, besides having been a Marine, was an amateur artist, a cartoonist. Encouraged Keith in drawing original cartoons when he was 4 years old. So in all that way, Al Herring is up there, I think, with Warhol and Disney as big artistic influences on Keith.
Yeah, I thought it was, the entire relationship with the family that you convey over the course of the book. Are these folks still around? Or
his father just died this past summer. I loved his dad. And everyone else is around.
Yeah, the quotes you bring in from them, A, very informative, B, there's still that sense of, but we didn't talk about the gay thing, or you don't talk about being gay. Just Juan Rivera would come with him, and he was his bodyguard, and that was the joke.
Yeah.
But
that's what I think I meant about a transitional generation in a certain way. So it wasn't that everyone was totally closeted or just never spoke to their parents again, and gay liberation was going on, and all of this was part of the news of the time. So it was different than the 50s or the 40s. At the same time, which I totally understood from my parents. Like what Keith's mother said. Keith never said the word gay to me, and he never said the word AIDS. made kind of complete sense to me, because I had sort of the same relationship where I didn't talk about these things with my parents. It was kind of understood. Howard would come home with me. He came in a wheelchair when he had AIDS and was sick at the end. All this accepted, right? But barely talked about. And also, I was writing gay poems, gay novels, gay stories. I mean, all that was very open, and I gave them to them, and that was all great. But it was never,
as opposed
never
to clipping out all the penis paintings that Harry had in the newspaper,
right? So there was a fun, that was helpful to understand that moment, because I think you can really flatten things. I hear, and Keith's family has mentioned that to me. I mean, you hear these descriptions of what his family was, sometimes journalistic descriptions.
You stereotype.
It's like flattened. So these kind of evangelical Marines who didn't want him to be gay or be an artist. And it was more complicated. So they came to all his openings. They were very proud of him. They were there at the end. All families were not during the time of AIDS. So relationship, complicated kind of relationship, but not certainly one. I remember in writing City Poet, Grace Hartigan said to me, "You leave all that." I mean, when I was trying to talk to her about Frank O'Hara's childhood or her childhood, and that was the ethos of the time. I mean, everyone reinvented themselves, and in New York, and
that was a big part of what Michael Dennany and I were going to talk about was the shaping of what that identity meant from Stonewall onwards. That there were things like Christopher Street, at least the way he portrayed it, which other people would have countered, I guess. That identity still had to be made. Right. It was still there to be formed. Right. And while people were flocking to New York to become something other than who they were at home. Right. It's one of the weird tangents. We've all been watching a lot of TV in the last 4 years. Yes. I've been binging old shows instead of new stuff. Barney Miller, of all things, the portrayal of gay life in New York that pops up there, even when it's not spoken, really subtle. I mean, there's a couple of flaming characters who show up also, but they're treated like human beings as opposed to just a joke. But there's moments in there where you're like, these are two men who were living together, and one of them died and the other one's been arrested for stealing his body from the morgue so he can go bury it, even though they were just roommates. But, there are all these hints and clues of life in the city. What it meant is these guys were inventing, who they were at the time.
Well, I was watching Fellow Travelers, which is also...
I've heard it's great. I haven't watched it yet.
I mean, that reconstruction. And again, what I was talking about, reflection, I mean, is another example of reflecting back onto that period and things becoming history.
What surprised you the most in the book?
With Keith, I'm trying to think. That's. I think it's the most boring answer. Is that what a serious artist Keith Haring was, and that. I mean, even I, didn't quite understand how intense he was at working 24/7, and how this had begun so early, and he had kind of taught himself so much. And then, if you read these his notebooks from when he was a teenager, there's a kind of tone of voice that seems very naive and too ambitious and dramatic, and just the intensity of the voice, and that doesn't change. And then you read him 10 years later, and it's the same. It's like
I had that joke. I was telling my wife as a joke, I was going to ask you, this book was about 6 or 7 years. His career was about 11 years. He produced a lot more than you did. I'm just kidding. But her response was, cocaine was a hell of a drug. I assume, with him, yes, there was a nightlife on top of the artistic production.
Yeah, it wasn't so much cocaine.
No, you never bring that. It's more weed and everything else.
Weed and then mushrooms and acid and stuff. And again, but he like William Burroughs. I mean, in terms of minor surprises, I was surprised how important William Burroughs was in his life. I was surprised how close the relationship was with Warhol, both in terms of life and work in a certain way. So those are surprises. I think, like one thing, like Burroughs, that he made use, instead of being destroyed by drugs, as people were around Burroughs and they were around Keith Haring. I mean, he was using it for his work in a certain way, always. I mean, from the first time he took acid in his room when he was a teenager, he started drawing, and he drew new kind of abstract lines and forms, and it became his style for the next few years. So he was always very, I think, aware of, all of this went into the work. I mean, if you work as much as he did, all the, Paradise Garage, then puts dance into his work, and so there's a kind of, I mean, it's not like he was taking acid and drugs every day and painting. It wasn't that, and it was a lot more what you were talking about, that it's also party at night, but he also doing a lot of work. But it informed him in the way that that his three-eyed famous image came to him after being up dancing and doing ecstasy all night, and it becomes like the third eye kind of image for him. So there definitely, and the look of the work always has a kind of brightness to it, and there's something, the coloring, kind of acid coloring of it. He does owe, I think, something to drugs in terms of his aesthetic, but not so much that he needed drugs to work. He obviously didn't need anything to work. But there was something of that.
Brought out another dimension.
Yeah. I mean, the aesthetic, it was, was connected to discoveries in his own adolescence, and important to him. He was also friends with Timothy Leary. I mean, he was friends with these kinds of 60s characters. He was someone a little bit in search of the 60s.
You mentioned that a few times. I wondered for yourself, whether you had the same vibe in your own life.
Oh, absolutely. Except I said I was a little younger, like 6 years. I mean, 6 years. Wait.
He was born 58.
He's younger. Yeah, but I mean, I was born earlier. That's what I'm trying to say. So I was older in the 60s, and I was 16 in 1968. So for me, it was a little less than the. I experienced it a little more the first time around. And with Keith, you definitely see him sort of searching. It's searching for it. But there was a funny comment and insightful from Brendan Strasser, who's at the Historical Museum at Society in Kutztown, about how everything came to Kutztown late, and the the 60s, it was just when the 70s was when the 60s was finally hitting Kutztown, and there's something to that, so Keith's hit of this kind of liberation activism messaging came to him by watching television at his grandmother's and seeing the 68 convention, but then his parents shut off the TV, and so he had to kind of really look a little bit to get to that.
And you brought up his youthful Nixon support, but again, you're a little kid.
Yeah, I mean, that's and he was at the Reagan White House, in the height of it. So that's what's interesting about biography. I mean, I think there are points at which you'd have to be such a brilliant novelist to do what life does naturally, which is set up these kind of contradictions. I mean, it'd be easy to draw Keith, if I'd written that novel, as a your regular young hippie kid, and yet he was in this Republican family, and he was doing, he had the letter from the Nixon campaign, "Thank you for helping us." It was interesting, part of it, and I talk about that in the book, that Keith was, he was such a visual person, that you kind of, that the part of that attraction at that age was the style of it all, right? So he loved
the symbology of things. He had all those visuals that jump out at him.
I mean, he loved all this campaign stuff. He loved the buttons, and he loved McGovern buttons. I mean, all this stuff. But then he filmed like Nixon stickers on his dog, right?
The image of which just stuck with me completely when I read that. I'm like, I could see that completely. I understand what it's going to look like.
Right. So that's a contradiction, supposedly. I mean, it's not. Finally, and also even so again, I know that at that time, politics wasn't as binary as it is now, so it was possible to be all these things. I mean, I remember with my parents in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, going to see Nixon in like a cavalcade. I mean, his car went around the public square, and it was kind of exciting.
I happened to be in Washington. My brother was at American University, so I happened to be in Washington for George Bush Sr.'s inauguration. I was visiting my brother, and the inauguration was going on. I'm like, I may as well go because not a lot of people say, "Oh yeah, I was at the inauguration route and got to see the president go by," even if it's someone you
right.
Yeah. But yeah, we end up in some strange circumstances that, real life is much stranger than fiction. Did his literariness surprise you in general? Had you thought of him before this primarily visually as opposed to someone who had Robert Henry and all the other influences that came out, Burroughs, etc.? Yeah,
no. I mean, all of that.
Not just the closeness with them as people, but the...
Right. No, the academic intellectual side of Keith, not to over inform it, but was surprising to me. I think that the poet part made sense to me, and again, something that I kind of understood from having been around at that time. I mean, I was writing art stuff and writing about galleries in the Lower East Village, and like really little magazines at that time, and I was a poet, and it was really the poets who were not just discovering this scene, but making it in different ways. I mean, sort of Patti Smith was a poet who then becomes this performer. So there's that way to go.
Thinking of Sheldon, the art critic, who tried starting out as a poet.
Yeah.
I got to record with him a year before he died. That was one of the all-time greats for me. I love his
art criticism, especially. And then, but I remember going to a Basquiat show at somewhere. It was probably the Fun Gallery, but I remember going to the opening. And I mean, the two things, I just remember how sexy he was. That was my original, that was my main take on Basquiat. But the other is that David Wojnarowicz was really a poet. And when people talk about him as an artist, I'm always surprised because I just remember the earlier time when he was giving readings with like Dennis Cooper. And Basquiat was very much part of that. I mean, he was a poet to me also. I mean, and these works, and he was to Keith coming same-o. I mean, Keith saw his poetry, and so poetry was almost, you forget, a kind of dominant art at the time, along with rock music, and so Basquiat was someone whose work made sense in that context, and Keith intuitively, his work made sense in that context too, because it was figurative and it was narrative, and it was poetic. I mean, so that part kind of made sense to me. The way in which Keith, for a while, thinks of himself as a poet. I mean, he's not painting, and he's giving poetry readings at Club 57. But
which you convey is not the most successful of events.
Right. Stick to your day job of like artist, But the the intellectual aspect of it. I mean, where he's putting together his aesthetic. He really thinks it through before he does it, and that's surprising for such a spontaneous artist. So I was
going to say you can do that, but you end up with horrendously boring art usually, and very, very jargon heavy. And he creates something that's publicly accessible.
I mean, just the way that he really got a lot out of School of Visual Arts, and certainly semiotics class with Bill Beckley, and the reading of all those semiotics guys, and they, he had like two concepts in a way. He was almost like a conceptual artist, and one of them was he wanted to develop, and this was from semiotics, language, a visual language, and then he developed one. He started drawing the radiant baby and the flying saucer, and telling stories with them, the exploding nuclear bomb, the crawling human, and rearranging them in different ways, influenced by Burroughs' cut-up method. So he did that. He created a language, and he didn't appropriate or.
I was going to ask. There's in addition to your book, because I was, I've been reading, more and more on Herring, the cultural appropriation aspect of using, we'll say, graffiti. I hate the word tropes, but, the techniques and ways of approaching that, and the black and brown history in graffiti, and what it means for a white kid from suburban Pennsylvania to adopt all this.
Yeah, that's an interesting big question.
Yeah, I'm not even quite just throwing it out there as a giant thing.
The last thing I was going to say about his concept, and it leads into that, was art for everybody, and figuring out a way, right, to include everyone. And so in this 1 year, then he develops that language, and he starts doing the subway drawings, and the two then create Keith Haring. But he had thought about all of that before, and he was trying very much to find his way into it. Then the question of the other artists that he was connecting to, and his identification, affiliation with subway art and graffiti artists and artists of color and street art, and all of that. And
you being a white guy writing his biography, that's
right. So Keith was, again, first of all, it was very, for whatever reason, very natural to him. I mean, sexually, he was erotically, he was attracted to black and Latin guys. When he was in high school, he was writing like his essays about Geronimo and the treatment of the Native Americans, and the white. He was already politically active in all these ways, right? And I think that's the. So he is. He is fantastically attracted to subway art and street art, and again, that wasn't a totally black-brown creation. I mean, there were also white kids who were doing that too, but to have art like that in that TV color, acid color, and to have it visible and available to everybody, that was irresistible to him. He was always a kind of, like his dealer Tony Shafrazi said to me that Keith was a sponge, and Keith was a sponge, and you see him going through his life and sponging up all this stuff, and he definitely sponged up the subway art. He came at such a peak moment, 1978, for that art.
Yeah, I tried explaining to my wife, who's not from the area, that The Warriors, that movie, was actually a documentary, largely, of New York. It wasn't fiction, but anyway.
Right. But I think he was, what we're talking about, if anyone was aware of it, if any white kid could be aware of it, Keith was. Because he picked up on, when like Robert Hughes was calling Basquiat the Eddie Murphy of art. Keith picked up on the racism of that when people were complaining about Basquiat being kept in the basement by Anina Nosé and that being like slavery. Keith was aware of the racism of that. I mean, he was very attuned to these issues. And so, and he does, it's interesting how he does it. When he first starts doing street art, after he invents these kinds of images, he's always putting he's not competing. He's like finding the bottom of the lamppost and putting these images. And that becomes, if you want to see a Keith Haring, he's like, you get used to looking down. And when he goes to the subways, he doesn't do subway art. I mean, he's not, only once or twice did he ever paint in the subways, and he was like afraid of being caught. Right. So he does.
And being the white guy, being seen as the ringleader.
It's very much like an art student concept here. He like finds these black advertising panels, and he does these drawings which are in chalk, which are adjacent to these big wild style statements with bubble lettering, but they're not that. So he always seems like he knows. He's not like pretending to be a graffiti artist exactly. You know what I mean? He's not. He's more a fan in some way, very fanboy all his life about other people's work, and he finds these ways to kind of respect the art of the graffiti artist and the subway artist and the street artist, and at the same time to make his own kind of statement. So I don't see it exactly like someone in the 50s putting on a French beret and growing a little mustache and goatee and pretending to be. He wasn't quite doing that. But
some of the critiques did feel very much 2020s politics being applied to 1985, which I know in theory we knew a lot of things back then, but there was an awful lot of change in terms of, whatever we want to call intersectionality or all that stuff.
Right. But it's interesting that a lot of criticism doesn't come so much from other, like black artists and creatives. I mean, it doesn't come from Bill T. Jones. It doesn't come from Fat Five
That to me was
Fred.
a one uncomfortable moment when he does the body paint of Bill T. Jones. Right. That in itself, I was okay with. The suddenly opening the door and bringing in a bunch of tabloid press when Jones didn't know they were going to be there. Felt a little, but I wasn't sure how much of a race aspect you overlay on that as opposed to just an artist not quite realizing that his canvas is a human being in that moment. Yeah, no, that's interesting. But Bill was aware of it, so it was nice to get his consciousness of that going on. But it's interesting to especially now, because the book come out now, to think about how Keith fit in to all that and how we see it fitting in now. It was similar with Flannery O'Connor when I was writing that book and when the book came out, and she was she racist or wasn't she racist, and how she uses the N-word and all of that with her, but it was also again funny that or interesting that a lot of the important readers and critics who came to her defense about that were like Toni Morrison and Hilton Als, and that they kind of got it what she was doing in some way, and I think similarly with Keith, it's interesting that he's never really been attacked by that community. I mean, there's always a kind of respect there. It was like watching the Little Richard documentary on HBO recently, and when the academics start speaking is when everything grinds to a halt. That's, it's all the performers and people who watched him, talking about the experience. It's great when you get somebody who 30 years old and steeped in jargon. They're going to come in with a theoretical perspective on what he should have been as opposed to what the experience was.
Right. Well, we can, that's something one could do. I mean, and so, it's not uninteresting, right?
But it can get... Yeah, it depends on how it's portrayed. Yeah,
right.
How it's
but again,
conveyed.
biography is helpful in terms of context and things. So a lot of times you're writing about or thinking about, I don't know, Stephen Sondheim, John Ashbery, figures who could be closety in a way, and how that, it's interesting to think about how it is reflected in their work and informs their work and their life and things. It's different than to say that's like a terrible bad thing. They were alive in the times that they were alive in. And so that's a question that's like, if the South had won the Civil War, we can't really answer.
Sure.
But
this is your fourth biography, fifth if we count Smash Cut. I consider that more memoir than biography.
That's more memoir than biography, but yeah.
Fifth nonfiction, anyway, we'll go with.
Biography/memoir.
What have you learned?
That's a category. Learned about what? Biography writing?
The act of writing a life.
Well...
Besides the importance of place, as we talked about earlier.
A few things, I think. Well, the first was importance of place. So,
so we got that one done already.
Because I remember Sonny Maeda was my editor on City Poet, and bought that book. It was, I think, the first book that he bought when he came to New York.
Oh, wow.
And then and I went in with my first kind of 100 pages, written in this kind of breezy Vanity Fair style, in a way, and then and Sonny read them, and I just remember he said, Brad, people who read biographies really want to know what the silverware was on the table, or what the curtains were like in his parents' house, and I was like, oh, they are? Because I am too. But
I didn't think anybody else
allowed to do
stuff.
that. Yeah. And that was great advice, because it was really about getting grounded in a sense, and so that was in the place. I've learned that. I've kind of learned. I figured out a way of doing research that I kind of came into, finding my way, but it's now like a law of how it's going to happen for me, which is just doing all this, which is years of research up front in a way. Like I went to the Keith Haring Foundation for years and looked at everything. I interviewed over 200 people. Then there's a point then when you sit down to write that it's almost like the real research begins, because then you're like, things are falling to the side they just aren't going to use, like on the cutting room floor, and then there's something else, like Keats arrives in New York. It's the summer of 1978, and then you're thinking, well, what was the summer of 1978? Was it?
That's a whole thing.
Was it hot? Was it raining? Was it? What were people doing? Yeah. So there's that kind of then the practical research of it. And so that part, that's the way that I do that. I remember Joyce Carol Oates once said to me, why don't you just start writing? Like, it's waste your time. Just start writing and then research as you go along. But I don't do it that way.
Which is why there's only one page of books by Brad Gooch here, as opposed to 25 pages of
Yes, it was probably good advice, and I'm dumb to do it. Maybe next time I'll try it, but I don't seem to be able to do quite that. And the other would be, now that I'm an old man, that
who looks very young.
There's a certain way. Or maybe I just didn't think I was allowed to do this. But there's a certain kind of, and certainly with Keith, like a empathetic, sympathetic way to treat this person, right? And it might have, I remember with the Frank O'Hara biography, someone said to me, and I think this was really like a idea of biography at the time. They said, if you had even like seen Frank O'Hara or met Frank O'Hara, then you wouldn't be able to do this biography. It would like skew it in some certain way.
Yeah.
And that was it was an idea of like objective, like you're supposed to be objective, right? And if you're part of the life or the situation, then you can't be objective, right? And so I think there was an aspect of that, and certainly now is, or this is the perfect book for it. But Keith's a sympathetic character. I mean, he definitely has his problems and his issues.
You don't make him heroic.
He's
by
also
any means,
no. He's also young.
Yeah.
So you have to, all of these things come into it. Like, so that's what I think of. I mean, I think there'd be a way to write a nastier version of someone who was like on drugs all the time and driven by fame and having
the fame horror aspect
people
of it
flame
was,
out around him,
yeah.
And is ripping off other cultures and all this kind of stuff. But it's just not it doesn't seem true. I mean, so I think that something about the depth of my connection to the people I'm writing about and things is a little more mature.
Could you have written this book younger? If you had that license to write about someone you knew, do you feel like this is something you could have written at 40? Or did you need?
Let me see. What year was 40?
I was throwing that number out
really
there, realizing
that's like, could I have written when Keith? That's right, when Keith died.
Yeah, you would have
when
been.
Howard died, and when all of this was what it was.
I'm telling you, he looks remarkable for his age.
I don't. No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it wasn't. Mike Nichols once told me you could drop a name in the. And then drop another name, that Stanislavski said that it takes 30 years to make a memory. I forget how many years it was, or maybe it was just 7 years to make a memory. But it was the idea that you couldn't, writing about something in the moment is different than writing about it retrospectively. And I couldn't have written this book particularly because it wasn't history.
Yeah.
And
even then, maybe 10 years later would still be not quite the. I just wonder if the age you're at now, whether that maturity you mentioned is sort of necessary, not just for historical.
Well, I think
perspective.
it's also I mean, I guess the mature. What am I calling maturity? It's like, fuck it, I can be nice if I want, or something.
Yeah, the reverse of immaturity in that respect.
Right. Yeah. Right. So I don't feel. People looking over my shoulder, and I don't feel, anxiety of reception as my, like all those kinds of things which seem immature. So I couldn't have done that. And maybe I wouldn't have done it. I mean, in choosing the subject, part of it is I have these two kids. One is now 5 and one is now 9, but the one who was 9, at the time I was kind of also deciding what I wanted to write about or would write about. First of all, I would carry Walter around every night and we say goodnight to the art, and he would always point at the Keith Haring, and I think because of the red and in it. But I was sort of thinking like I would need to work on something where, like in New York, probably, like I need to be here. And it'd be nice to be writing about something that, well, they can't necessarily going to read it, that the world is about and all that is kind of accessible in some way, right? And Keith is such a kid-friendly artist. And it is true. I mean, I can go to Walter's school and there are kids wearing Keith Haring T-shirts around, and they know his name, and on the hall opposite his classroom was this long sheet where these kids were learning to draw by imitating Keith Haring. So I go to see Walter's classroom, and there are all these Keith Haring
radiant babies everywhere.
So it's a lot. I mean, it's part of his conversation now, and so that was also a reason. Would I ever? I mean, I always wanted to write it, but I think I would have written it probably differently. Certainly, this the kid, Keith's relationships with children, that aspect of his life was really very interesting. And then it's very interesting to talk to them now as adults, but the memories they have are kid memories and kid perspectives. Like Sean Lennon, I talked to Sean Lennon, and then he was comparing Andy Warhol to Keith, because Andy was always jealous that Sean, the 9-year-old, liked Keith more than him. But he was saying that Andy had kind of like a chic style, and he would wear these blazers at Mr. Chow's. And he said, but I didn't really know what chic was. And Keith was dressed, in the sneakers and T-shirts and the style I understood, an urban style from, middle school. And similarly that Andy's work, he didn't really understand Andy's work. It wasn't made for him in that way.
Yeah.
Whereas Keith's work, these cartoon characters and the exuberance and the color, that all spoke to him. So these kids had a really interesting relationship to him, and that his relationship to them was so real. I mean, that he'd rather be sitting. You
really
with
get
the
that
kids
across the amount of time, or just the natural, vibe he had with kids.
Right.
Being godfather to a couple of them, officially and unofficially.
Yeah, exactly.
It'll be a huge overarching question, but it's been 7 years since we got together. Fatherhood? Parenthood?
Yes. What about it?
How has it been? As someone who doesn't have kids and has no plans,
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Great. And so that, that's what I'm saying, that
perspective
aspect of Keith, I don't know if I would have quite have, picked up on it as much as I picked up on it. And the kids are incredible, but it's also, I'm glad I had them at the age that I did. I mean, 60 is like a great time to have kids, age 60. But earlier, I think I would have been a terrible parent.
Yeah.
Because I had other things, I would have felt pulled to go out and have fun or go out and network or do...
Or even the time spent writing in a different way that
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so all of that would have been kind of conflicted. But now that I have a boring life and that I have, this little separate place to write, it turns out that I just love to get down on the floor and play, and I can do it for hours. It's kind of embarrassing, and I don't have any better place to be. Or I don't have the feeling that I have any better place to be. So it makes me kind of available, I think, in a way that I wouldn't have been when I was 40, especially if we're talking about the 80s.
Yeah, well, that particular, it was one of the questions I was going to ask, what do you miss about the 80s besides being young, which, that's...
Well, that says a lot right there. And I guess it's things that we get a virtual hit of now in the way that we're connecting with people online and people of similar interests. And Instagram reminds me of 80s social life, because it's kind of, you have these friends and you're telling each other what you do and you like each other and but you don't really know each other in a way, right? And the 80s was very much like that. And I could see a certain amount of that in interviewing people about Keith, that he was everyone, all these
had
people,
a version of Keith, you mean?
Yeah, but it was just that they all, they were at the Fun Gallery with him, and they were Club 57 with him, and they were everywhere with him, and yet they were nowhere with them in the sense that who was he, and what, and what do you really remember beyond that? And sometimes that was, could be kind of thin. But I do miss the way in which you had to go out, and the first line in my book is when Keith Haring came to New York in 1978. He hit the streets, and the streets, really, you had to be on the streets And if you wanted, you met people cruising on the streets, and you saw all these posters and messages and things on the street, and you need to go to a club, to go to a party. So all of this social life was happening, and it was, things were opening up because of it. That was very exciting. And so, as I said, we get this version of it now on Facebook and Instagram and things, but it's also not quite the same.
Yeah, virtual memories. That's why I make my show.
Right, exactly.
Who do you wish you could have interviewed for this? Either living or somebody who, we'll say somebody who died post Keith. Not Juan Dubos or someone like that.
There's someone I wish I could have continued interviewing, Diego Cortez, who was the curator of the New York New Wave show, very important that he put Keith into, and actually, was kind of a dealer for Basquiat and even less for Keith at a certain point. But Diego Cortez was just one of those people at the time, right, who was very an influencer of that moment in terms of the art world, and meant a lot, and discovered all these artists and pushed their work and talked about them and wrote about them, and it's just very smart. I just remember, like, when I was interviewing him, and he said, the 70s art world was all white people in white rooms drinking white wine. He just had a way of nailing things. And he was very good about Keith and very, kind of interested. And so what was going to happen, and he had been kind of sick, and then he died of COVID. He had certain kind of immune conditions, and then he got this kind of serious COVID and died. I mean, it was amazing.
Is there any parallel that you felt during being in New York during the early days of COVID versus what the 80s were like during the AIDS crisis?
I think yes and no.
Different disease, different speed, all that stuff. But
yeah, also you could during COVID you could leave. I noticed half the people left. We couldn't leave during AIDS, and then and also COVID was a national event and a national conversation in some way, even though they messed it up so horribly or pretend whatever that was about. But AIDS was very, especially if you were talking about the art world in Manhattan or in San Francisco, but I certainly knew Manhattan, and I think I quote in my book, Charlie Kaiser said in a book of his that like young men under a certain age fighting in World War II, it was like 7% of them were killed or something. The rate of gay men under the age of 50 who were living in Manhattan who died of AIDS was like 50%. Yeah. So to be in it and just have people dying left and right, and to be going to memorial services every night, and and to go to like doctors, waiting rooms that were packed, and the density of death at that time was much greater, and the politics of it, so that there's just so much kind of stigma that went along with it, like all of that stuff.
As a suburban white kid living 25 miles away from all this, I feel, I don't want to say complicit, but that was the background. We're getting the tabloid version of what this was.
Right.
And it was, the re-education I've gotten through, reading over the years and getting to know people, sitting down with Edmund White and people like that too. Blurbed on the back of your book.
Yes. Love it.
Yeah, it's just a different world than what we were getting on Channel 4 and what we're seeing in the New York Post.
Right. But when I was saying about the so Diego dies, and he sent me a picture, and it was like a selfie like 2 days before he dies. Where I mean, he looks like Ezra Pound. He has he's gone white and he's lying in the. But what he wanted to do, and he suggested, is we should go through. I'd like to go through Keith's art with you. Like I haven't looked at it in 30 years or something. And so we had, we're going to do this project of looking through the work, and he would be a great person to do that with, because he wasn't just like a big enthusiast. I mean, he was like a critical kind of thinker about stuff, and it would be interesting to see what his take would have been. So I missed that part.
And when it comes to his legacy artistically, you mentioned like kids being taught how to draw, seeing if they can replicate or try to create. When I started drawing, one of my tricks was to look who was born or died on that day. And I guess the first year of Keith's death anniversary, I tried doing one of his angels like this. And good Lord, is that line difficult to replicate. I'll send you a scan of it, but it's one of those like, he was not just half-assing and quickly doing this. This is real work to try to make this thing look like what it looks like. But when it comes to younger artists, I interviewed a guy a year or two ago, Timothy Goodman, who has been quote unquote accused of being like Herring, although he contends, I like Keith's work. I go in a different direction.
That was going to happen.
Yeah,
remember?
Yeah.
I mean, he said because he was being accused of being like Pank or something, and he said, like in the future there are going to be these young artists who are going to be accused of being like me, but it's not true. I mean,
and that was Tim. I zapped Timothy. I said, "Do you have any questions?" He's like, "Ask him about who owns the line, because we all develop our own styles, and we all like as you said, Tony Shafrazi's take on it, being a sponge. Every artist has to." Whether it's writing or making visual art. But it's those questions, I guess, of what it means to make that sort of public art and know that you're going to be, well, obviously this is a Herring homage or ripoff, depending on, how you feel about the affection of the artist. But just at the time, I guess, could you have imagined the ongoing influence / survival of Keith's work?
You mean in the 80s, kind of?
Even in the immediate aftermath, was there a sense of this is the stuff that people are going to be?
Yeah, I suppose I didn't think about it.
Sure.
So I wasn't particularly thinking in those terms. And then even once I started this biography, it took going. There was a retrospective of Keith's work at the Tate, Liverpool, and it was the first time that I was going into a museum show. It wasn't so much. There wasn't all this music playing and all this kind of the 80s paraphernalia of it, and then you just had these works like this 30-foot long drawing, and to see them on the wall in that way. In this new world and new context, you really all of a sudden it was like, I mean, these are enduring, and they were meant to endure. Yeah. I mean, they're very. Keith knew that he wasn't. That
was the one thing you got at in one of his early journals when he was early 20s. That sense of art is long, life is brief. That he knew.
Right.
I mean, it raised the question for me. AIDS only comes up a few years after he's already in New York and he's already this hyper-productive self. And trust me, I'll let you leave soon. I know you've got other stuff to do today. But how much that sense of mortality drove the I don't want to say production, the art making. How much was the fire driven by I'm going to die. It's clearly none of us are making out of this alive. Not knowing he's going to die at 31, but that sense that having the maturity at a younger age to know that the art is going to be what they remember me for, not me as a person. Although you do a great job with this book. But how much, I guess, and it's a weird way to phrase it, how much did AIDS drive that?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, he always had it, which was interesting. And then where that came from, I do not know. So he had this idea that, and maybe it was just partly a romantic idea, live hard, die young. I mean, that was his self-image. So he wasn't envisioning himself as a 72-year-old, and but then when he is diagnosed as HIV positive, and he has these KS lesions and things, then instead of withering away, he revs everything up. I mean, he does more and more and more work, and goes to more and more and more places, and that is very consciously.
The amount of travel you document before and even or afterwards, but even before, when he suspects for a couple of years, this is
right,
incubating. It feels clear then. I wonder how much was, whether again AIDS is just standing in for that sense of romanticism as you.
No, I mean then obviously he knows he's going to die, and so and one thing is he sets up this kind of secret studio where he's doing all these paintings, many of them great. I mean, a lot of really, really great work was done at the beginning and at the end of his career, and so that was completely aware about what he was doing. Yeah.
Second to last question: your favorite herring? Is it the one on your wall?
Well, I like that, but the one on my wall was a New Year's card to Howard, so it has a lot of emotion to it in some way. I love. There's there's this Red Room painting that's at the Broad.
Yeah,
I love that painting. I mean, and it brings together so many parts of him. I mean, by that time, the Sponge had been in Europe as a world artist and was going to all these museums, and you begin to see very much the Picasso and the Leger and all these things are influencing his work. I mean, he's not on the streets of New York at that time,
and the Red Room by itself implies Matisse,
right? So he has so it's his take on Matisse, and at the same time, this kind of odalisque figure, and it is very much straight from those high school cartoons that he was doing. And so that's everything there, I think. So I like that, and I love the original images that he did in that first kind of year after he discovered them. So all those barking dogs and ziggurats and flying saucers, those are great, and they really have a kind of roughness and poetry to them. So I love that work.
Final question, which it's been 7 years, and you should know this is coming, but what have you been reading?
Well,
I wasn't sure if you're going to remember. Oh yeah, Gil's going to ask that.
In the present, what am I reading?
Yeah, what are you
been
reading?
Right now I'm reading Cynthia Carr's Candy Darling.
I got that. They haven't told me if she'll do the show yet or not. I know it's coming out in a few weeks, but
yeah.
I don't want to start it and then discover, oh no, she doesn't do interviews. So, how is it?
Great. I saw she did an interview with Interview Magazine, so I think she'll do it.
I'm a little lower tier than that, but I'll try.
No, it's really interesting that because Candy Darling is such a campy figure and part of the the Warhol superstar world, and that she was kind of beyond Jackie Curtis. I mean, a real 24/7 performance artist performing this glamour. But then you write about her now, and Cynthia Carr is very sensitive to the way we're naming gender and dealing with gender and her place as a trans pioneer while being retro. So at this moment is part of what makes that a really kind of interesting book to me.
And other stuff that's made you plots recently.
And what?
And other books that have made you plots recently. Sorry, doing my Yiddish. Other books that have knocked the hell out of you.
Oh, okay. That's right. They have been. I mean, I really love Day, the Michael Cunningham novel, which reminds me of the early Home at the End of the World work of his. I mean, it's just it's nice to hear his voice again, and also he's very good. And I emailed him to ask about this. he was good about psychology of kids and parents or grown-ups in general. So I asked, like, how do you know? Like, and he wrote something like, well, how do we know whatever we know? Like, but I did enjoy that. And my kind of guilty pleasure, should I tell you?
Yeah.
Is
no one's listening.
I'm reading My Name is Barbara, the Barbra Streisand memoir, which I, can't get away from.
It being 900 pages, I could see.
1,000 pages. I don't mind 1,000 pages. And also weirdly reminds me of Knausgaard, which I love.
I'm in book 2 right now. I gave it a 10-year gap. Yeah. I figured I would get to Knausgaard when no one else is reading him. So I started earlier this year, and I'm just headlong. I described it to someone last week, it being the way somebody once described the Nancy comic strip. Mm-hmm. It's easier to read Knausgaard than not to read him. Once you start, you just...
Right.
I'm lying there in bed, ready to fall asleep, and 20 pages have gone by on my Kindle. I'm like, okay, I am all in with this guy. So.
Well, if you love Knausgaard, you'll like Barbra Streisand. Because it's like... Because it's like the formula or whatever is you have this personality. I mean, Knausgaard is like this... He's himself, and he's just a larger than life personality. It's just like she's the same. It's completely, she's telling you the truth about it, just, about her 16-year-old self, and the kind of confidence and all of it is really unusual. So that's fascinating. And then, but the other important part, and Knausgaard calls his a novel at least, is the kind of memory. She has that kind of descriptive memory. Like, is it real? But she can name the 6 different kinds of pastrami sandwiches in the delis, within 5 blocks of her house in Brooklyn when she was 9 years old. And so that kind of detail, I'm like, love detail. And she has that. So that's like the combination that's in Knausgaard, where you have this personal, hyper romantic kind of personality, and then you have this OCD
absolute grounding
detail,
in the world,
that's cinematic. So I've been reading that, and I could go on. I've been reading other books, but
if there's anything that jumps out at you, just want to share with a lot of trans stuff. I haven't read Lucy Sant's book yet, but I have it. Yeah, and
I did read. Two others. One, Salar Abdo wrote this novel, A Nearby Country Called Love, I think it is. And Salar's an Iranian-American artist. He teaches writing uptown at City College. And I went to Iran 3 times writing the Rumi book, so I have a lot of Iranian interest. One of the many weirdnesses of the Islamic Republic is that Khomeini said that transsexual operations were allowed and were indeed paid for by the state. So in Iran, you have these transsexual operations for free going on, but they it has all these unintended consequences. There is a documentary about it you could find on YouTube or something. But so you have like guys getting a sex change operation so it'll be more conventional, like they're a woman or something, or if they're in a relationship with a guy, then they can be a normal couple. Except then what happens is the guy is not interested anymore because now it's a woman, and then but this is a novel set within this situation, and Salar really knows it. So I was just fascinated by that. And then there was another called The Disenchantment, and it was by Celia Bell. It was the first novel, came out in the last year, and it's historical, like set in Louis Couture's Paris, but based on a kind of anecdote of these, 2 women who had an affair, and then, but to get together and things, then one of them would dress up as a man and drive in her carriage to go see the other and stuff. So it was kind of great. But anyway, there's a trans theme going through my reading right now, I guess.
I won't ask about your next project in that case.
And there are art bios, but then like The Slip I really liked, and Ninth Street Women a few years ago.
They keep showing up in my little Amazon recommendations list when I update it with everybody I've been reading, or Goodreads, things like that. They keep with you should be reading The Slip too.
Yeah.
But again, I've got to do 50 of these a year, so that kind of impinges on my reading time, except for
do more.
It's always true. There's that sense of, burning the candle, and then you read, this book and realize how much more you could be doing and just feel guilty the whole time. Right. But we're not in our 20s. So, anyway. But Brad, thanks so much for coming on again. I would tell you need to write more so we can get you back on the show more often. But, it's always great connecting with you like this. And it's a really wonderful book.
No, great. Thank you. Great to see you again. We have this continuity.
And that was Brad Gooch. His new biography, Radiant, The Life and Line of Keith Haring, is out now from Harper. It's an absolute wonder and a real celebration, bringing Haring and his work to life for a new generation and recreating that 1980s New York scene, we'll call it, to perfection. Now, you can find out more about Brad and his work, including those past biographies of Rumi, Frank O'Hara, and Flannery O'Connor, over at his website, bradgooch.com. And that's all one word, BradGooch. He's also on Instagram as Brad Gooch, spelled the same way, all one word. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories show by telling other people about it. Let them know there is this podcast, comes out every week with really fascinating conversations with interesting cultural folks. You can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, or who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or art exhibition or piece of music or theater or comic or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by email, by direct message if we're connected on Instagram, by letter or postcard if you've got my mailing address. It used to be in the email that I send out every week, but maybe you can figure it out. Or by calling my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you go longer than that, you'll get cut off. Just call back, leave another message. And let me know if it'd be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with the listeners, but I'd never include something like that without the speaker's permission, so let me know. Now, if you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. I mean, I appreciate it, and it's always nice when somebody goes ahead and makes that gesture. I do have a Patreon. The email that I have has a paid tier, but there's no bonus material or anything. But really, give it to other people in need. My expenses are pretty minimal. My day job treats me well. But there are people out there who could really use your help. Institutions, too. With people, you can go through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Crowdfunder, all those other crowdfunding platforms where you'll find people who need help with medical bills or rent or veterinary bills or a car payment, getting an artistic project off the ground. There are people who just need a helping hand and can really get a lot done if they just didn't have quite as much money worry as they do. With institutions, I give to my local food bank every month, make occasional contributions to the Poor People's Campaign. I make targeted election contributions, but I'm a lobbyist by day, so that's kind of part of my job. But there are other things you can do. Planned Parenthood, Women's Choice Funds, election funds, freedom funds. There's a lot of things that if you've got a little bit of money to spare, you can use to help build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.